Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books on some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. St. John of the Cross, 1542 to 1591, was a priest of the Order of the Descalced Carmelites. He is a doctor of the Church and one of the greatest poets in the Spanish language. Juan de Yepes y Álvarez was born into a poor family in Fontiveros, near Avila, Castile. His widowed mother brought the young John and his surviving brother to Medina del Campo, where eventually he studied at the Jesuit school. In 1563, he entered the Carmelites. He studied at the prestigious University of Salamanca, and one of his teachers was Fray Luis de Leon. Shortly after his ordination to the priesthood, he met Teresa of Avila. He became a spiritual director to her and her nuns, and he joined her project to restore the Carmelite order to its original observance. The Carmelite order was opposed to some of the Descalced Carmelites' expansion, and in 1577, John was even taken prisoner by Carmelites and submitted to deplorable mistreatment. However, he managed to escape 9 months later. In 1580, Gregory XIII authorized the formal separation of the Descalced Carmelites from the Carmelites, and John occupied various positions in the government of the newly erected order. However, in 1591, after contesting some of the Vicar General's decisions, he was removed from all his positions as a councillor and sent to a remote monastery in Andalusia, where he fell ill. He died in Ubida in 1591, but left behind a series of exquisite lyrical poems and treatises on the spiritual life. Benedict XIII canonized him in 1726, and 200 years later, Pius XI declared him a doctor of the Church. His memory is celebrated on the 14th of December, and he is known as the Mystical Doctor. In this interview, Dr. Edward Howells discusses the works of St. John of the Cross. Dr. Edward Howells is Associate Tutor in Christian Spirituality at Ripon College, Cuddesdon. He teaches the history of Christian spirituality and its contribution to the understanding and practice of faith today. His research on mystical theology, especially the late medieval period, and he has written on the mystical theology of Augustine, Meister Eckhart, and Pierre de Bérulle. He is the author of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, Mystical Knowing and Selfhood, and co-editor of Teresa of Avila, Mystical Theology and Spirituality in the Carmelite Tradition. He is also co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Mystical Theology. Dr. Edward Howells, welcome.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Could you give a brief overview of St. John of the Cross's biography?
Sure. He was born in a small village in Castile called Fontiveros in 1542, and he was born into a family which fell upon hard times. His father was in the weaving industry and died when he was probably about 2 or 3, and his mother was then very cast into poverty and made a bit of a living by weaving. And John's elder brother, Luis, we know, died possibly of the famine, which was ravaging Castile at that time. So it was a hard beginning. He went to the family moved a few times before he went to school. They settled in Medina del Campo, and he went to a charity school called the Doctrina and learned basic grammar and things there. While he was there, he would have helped out at a local Augustinian house of nuns as part of the deal of going to the charity school a few hours every morning. He then managed to get into the Jesuit school in Medina, which was really his making academically. He received a very good education there by all accounts, and during that time was also considering whether to enter a religious order. He appears to have wanted to do that from a fairly young age, or at least in his teens. He entered the Carmelites at the age of 20 in Medina, and was sent by the Carmelites after making his profession a year later to the University of Salamanca, where he studied arts and then theology, a BA in arts, which would have included philosophy and theology. He was extremely talented academically. I expect his superiors expected him to stay longer at the university, but he met Teresa of Avila when visiting home in Medina in the summer vacation of after his fourth year of studies. And he was unsure of his vocation in the Carmelites. He was thinking of becoming a Carthusian because he was attracted to a harsher regime, a more strict ascetic regime, and to more solitude and contemplation. But Teresa said, look, we are starting a reform of the Carmelite order which will return it to its contemplative roots. How does that strike you? And John found that a very attractive idea, because he was attracted to the Carmelites anyway and was already a Carmelite, and he joined Teresa's reform. A year later, or a few months later, he was sent to start a new reformed Carmelite monastery in a remote village in Duruelo in Castile, with just 2 other friars. He built up that community and was then promoted through various positions in the Discalced Carmelite order. And during this time, there was a falling out between the reformed part of the order and the unreformed part. The idea was to reform the whole order. A lot of reforms of monastic orders were going on during the 16th century in Spain. The Carmelites had yet to be reformed, and this seemed the way to do it via this reform that Teresa had started. But problems of authority arose as to who was in charge of the reform. There were divisions between the various parties, between the King of Spain, who was interested in the reform, and the Pope, and the Nuncio and the General of the Order were all falling out at this time. And John was caught, as it were, in the crossfire, and was actually captured by the opposing party and taken to the Carmelite Priory in Toledo and imprisoned for nearly a year, being told he was being disobedient to the order, which of course cut him very much to the heart, because obedience was something he'd very much taken to heart as part of his vows. And it's assumed that his teaching on the dark night of the soul, really, his own experience of this was in this prison in the Carmelite monastery in Toledo, doubting his vow of obedience, asking where God was in this dark period, which was a psychological suffering for him, not just a physical one. He then made a remarkable escape from this imprisonment, apparently by throwing himself out of a high up window and landing on a ledge beneath, and making his way to the Discalced Carmelite nuns in Toledo, who took him in. He spent a few months recovering from the privations of the prison, and went on to write his remarkable works, encouraged by the nuns. He was writing poetry as a kind of hobby, I think, but also as a teaching aid. at this time, spiritual poetry. He's known these days as one of the greatest Spanish Golden Age poets. So even if we didn't have his spiritual teachings in the longer works, we would think of him as a great poet, I think. And the nuns said, could you write some commentaries telling us how your poems apply to the spiritual life? And so he writes quite long commentaries on quite short poems, using the images of the poems as a way of talking about the soul's journey towards union with God. Many images taken from the Bible, but elaborated and developed in his own words in poetry, which teach about the spiritual life. And the one that he's best known for is the image of darkness and light in the Dark Night poem, on which he writes the commentary, from which we get the phrase "the dark night of the soul," which has become, a household word. After this period, he has a very fruitful period of teaching and writing, and but then, unfortunately, there are further problems in the Carmelite order, in the now divided Carmelite order between the Calced, so-called Calced, Discalced, that's the unreformed and reformed branches of the order. No longer, they've separated, but within the reformed, the Discalced part, John has not a falling out exactly, but a disagreement with the way things are going, and he volunteers to go on a missionary expedition to Mexico, but he before he goes, he gets a cut in his leg, which goes septic, I guess we'd say, and starts to have a fever. Goes to a monastery in a place called Ubeda, to where he could have a cure for his. It's a place where you can cure for various illnesses, but he doesn't get better. He goes downhill rapidly, and he dies at the age of 49. But leaving these wonderful works.
So John entered the Carmelites out of devotion to the Blessed Virgin. The order's full title is the Order of the Brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mount Carmel. How is the order connected to Mount Carmel and the Blessed Virgin Mary?
Yes, a good question. Carmel, because during the period of the Crusades, some religious started a community on Mount Carmel in what's modern Israel, a hermit community, which and they traced their origins, mythologically back to Elijah as a contemplative order on Mount Carmel, and this is where we get the word Carmelites, and the Ascent, John's work, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, his first commentary on his poems of spiritual teaching. The order then becomes more like the friars. The rule is mitigated to allow for preaching and teaching outside the monasteries when this order moves back to Western Europe from the Holy Land and becomes a major order. So there are various versions of the rule. So that's where Carmel comes from. The devotion to the Virgin Mary is something that I'm a little hazy about. I know it was there always, but what the origin of that name is, I can't right now recall.
I think it had something to do with St. Simon Stock, who was the superior, I'm not sure if he was prior general or minister general, and he received an apparition with the Blessed Virgin. That's where they had the scapular, the
So
devotion
that
to the
would be,
scapular. I think that's where the Marian connection comes in.
would that be in the English among the English Carmelites? Would that be something that happened in Britain?
I'm not sure if it was in Britain or whether he was based in Europe at the time.
Mm,
I'd have to look that up. But I think that's where the connection with the Blessed Virgin comes in.
Yes.
And he was
yes,
sort of the one responsible for his expansion.
Yes, I'm sure you're right. Yeah.
St. John of the Cross was influenced deeply by St. Teresa of Avila. Are there any significant differences between their thoughts and approach to the spiritual life?
They were great friends. Teresa very much appreciated John's spiritual direction, which she invited him to her monastery of the Encarnacion in Avila, which she had reformed. And part of that reform, she invited him to be the confessor to her nuns, which was a high accolade. And she says very, very positive things about him in her letters. So we know that they were close. John also recommends her writings in his own. The first edition of her writings had been published while he was writing his, I think, The Living Flame of Love, or possibly the Spiritual Canticle. Anyway, there's a reference to her writings. Very different characters. You get the impression from sort of immersing yourself in the two writings. Teresa, of course, she had a very developed inward life, but she was quite an extrovert personality, sort of larger than life character. John, much more unassuming, self-effacing character. Very good with spiritual direction and one-to-one. Probably less comfortable in a crowd. In terms of teaching, Teresa is, I guess the main difference would be John's interest in what happens when God feels absent. So the psychological suffering of feeling that God is not present with you when you have devoted your life to prayer and so on. This is not something that Teresa really deals with. I mean, she talks about trials, but they're usually trials coming from outside rather than trials coming from inside. So the focus, certainly in John's Dark Night and Ascent of Mount Carmel, is different from anything that Teresa does.
And what led you to study St. John of the Cross?
I didn't know John until I was studying at university and as an undergraduate. And when I first read John of the Cross in the third year course as a theology degree, I was struck immediately by the depth and richness of the teaching. I think I was particularly interested in the notion that of what you do when you can't experience or don't experience God as you expect. This kind of, I suppose, pastoral or psychological question. And I found very exciting John's notion that that position can be a kind of invitation by God, that there is actually a reassurance in John, but also the courage to go into that sort of experience and to insist, if you like, that God can be found even when God feels absent. That paradox is an exciting one I found right from then, and I still do.
And you proposed 2 preliminary readings from St. John of the Cross and then 5 books. You recommend that those new to St. John start with the preliminary readings. The first one is the poem around which he writes his commentary, The Ascent of Mount Carmel and the Dark Night of the Soul, One Dark Night, in una noche oscura. Why should someone approaching the works of St. John of the Cross for the first time start here?
Well, if you open most editions, I think all editions that I've come across of John's works, you have the order is the Ascent of Mount Carmel, the Dark Night, then the Spiritual Canticle, and then the Living Flame of Love. These are his four major works. But if you start reading the commentary, that's the first one that you come to, the Ascent of Mount Carmel, most people quickly get bogged down. Because it becomes very intricate and quite long-winded, and in fact, not the best place to start with John. So I think that to counteract that problem, actually looking at the poetry first is much more inviting, and the poem One Dark Night contains really the central paradox of that he goes on to talk about, and which I was just saying was what first attracted me to John. This idea that even when things look dark, there is some invitation from God which draws the soul forth. And that comes out very powerfully in the poem in a way that is harder to see in the commentary. It's also there in the commentary, but the poem begins. This is an English translation, of course, from the Spanish. One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, the sheer grace, I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. In darkness and secure by the secret ladder disguised, the sheer grace. In darkness and concealment, my house being now all stilled. On that glad night, in secret, for no one saw me, nor did I look at anything, with no other light or guide than the one that burned in my heart. This guided me more surely than the light of noon to where he was awaiting me. Him I knew so well, there in a place where no one appeared. So there's this drawing forth, while everything looks dark, there's something that is deeper, which is drawing the soul forth towards the one who she loves. And this is God, of course, this is Christ. And that sort of paradox of overt darkness, but inward, an inward drawing forth into God is very strong in the poem. And I think that's the central paradox of the whole of the commentary.
One of the best known works of modern religious art is Salvador Dali's Christ the St. John of the Cross, which is housed in Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum in Glasgow. It was inspired by the saint's sketch of Christ and the cross. Instead of looking at Christ crucified from below or in front of him, it looks at him from above his left side. Why have you selected this sketch together with a prologue and diagram of the ascent of Mount Carmel, Subida del Monte Carmelo, as a second preliminary reading?
Yes, so the sketch, which apparently John gave to one of the nuns in Avila, not only shows that he was also quite a skilled artist, but it's a very emotive drawing of Christ's suffering, seen from above the cross. So we see Christ sort of leaning forward, and the weight, you feel the weight of his dying body on his arms and his nailed hands, and you see the crown of thorns on his head, and you see either sweat or blood, it's hard to tell, dripping from him. And it's quite gruesome in some ways, but there's also a very emotive quality about it, which makes one drawn towards, I mean, of course, for Christians, you see the love of God behind the suffering. And this is the kind of key to his theology of the Dark Night, is that Christ has gone into this place of agony and has redeemed it. And so I think the Christ on the cross drawing sort of is another way to understand the paradox of darkness and night, which comes close to the center of his own theology, because it links the suffering of the cross to the journey of Christ to meet humanity, to meet us in the darkness, and the quality of love which underpins the way the heart is drawn to Christ in that picture. Parallels the way that the heart is drawn through the darkness to God.
And there's also the diagram and the prologue.
And the diagram is just a nice picture of the whole of the ascent of Mount Carmel. And I think the diagram, it contains some of John's most famous verses, which he deals with in the ascent of Mount Carmel. I've got them here. Endeavor to being, where does it start? To reach satisfaction in all, desire satisfaction in nothing, to come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing, to arrive at being all, desire to be nothing. These very stark, sort of aphoristic statements, for which John is also well known. They come up in T.S. Eliot's poem East Coker, one of the 4 quartets, for instance. These are in the diagram, and you then see that the way of nothing, nada, 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 is the way to the summit of the mountain. So there's a nice picture of that. And on the summit of the mountain, there is abundance and life and love of God. So you also see the positive side. And this reflects John's whole teaching in the ascent of Mount Carmel of active and what he calls active and passive purgation. Active purgation is the way of ascetic, self-denial. Passive purgation is the apparent loss of God, or not actually loss of God. It is just apparent. It's the concepts, the things that we grasp onto to give us security that God is there, which are negated or lost against our wishes on this journey, which nevertheless reveal something that is more profound and more present than what we thought we had before, which is God deeper in the heart. And this is also the summit of the mountain. So it's the path through nothing is very well sketched, I think, there.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.